rehabilitation counselor. Okay, all right. Okay. And this month is even more special for me to be doing this because it is the disability employment month. This is the month that we commemorate that. So acknowledging people with disabilities who are actually working in the field. And so this is a great time for me to be sharing information with you all. All righty. So our learning objectives are to, sorry, I need to mute this, increase the awareness of the history and profession of rehabilitation counseling, highlight differences in vocational rehabilitation service provisions of persons with disabilities based on the client's race, and to understand the rehab counselor's role in integrating multicultural social justice counseling competencies and services provided to persons with disabilities from diverse cultural backgrounds. So the first thing that I need you all to do is to use this QR code and take this little Menti quiz and tell me what you think rehabilitation counseling is. And just one moment, I'm going to pull that up. Give me just one moment. All right. All right, sorry, y'all. Just give me 1 second. A little technical difficulty here. I want to make sure everyone has access to the QR code. Okay. All right. All right, so we're going to go over and see what that looks like, what your results are. All right. This worked really fine right before I did it, right? Just give me a minute, I'm sorry. Okay.
Are you able to put the code back up on the screen?
Hold on one moment. It's okay if you haven't been able to do it, it's quite fine. We're just gonna go from here. All right, so most of you said that rehab counseling, sorry, I just had it. Let's see. I'm sorry, y'all. This really worked well before I started this. So let's just talk about what you said. So what I hear individuals said that rehab counseling is I can't see it. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Assisting individuals with independent living, reintegration, helping persons with disabilities work, support, recovery, wellness, integration. Okay, empowerment, listening, right, good. So before tonight, how many of you have actually heard of rehabilitation counseling? By show of hands. Okay. Do I have any rehabilitation counselors in the building, in the room? I see a few names that I think I recognize. Okay, great. All right. Awesome. Okay. All right, so rehabilitation, and let's see, first semester in the program. Some of you are new in the program. Okay, great. All right. So we know that rehabilitation counselors help individuals with disabilities with their physical, emotional, mental, developmental, and cognitive disabilities live independently. So as independently as they want to, as freely as they want to, we work with individuals who have disabilities to achieve that goal. We help to really manage barriers to independence. And what we find in our work with people with disabilities is that a lot of the barriers are attitudinal, more so than some of the others. But there are personal, social, environmental, and professional effects of disability on employment. Can you guys see my screen? Okay. All right. Someone said they couldn't. All right. Ignoring the messages. And so rehab counseling involves supporting people with disabilities to function well in different environments. Rehabilitation counseling is a unique specialty area of counseling. We focus on disability advocacy and vocational rehabilitation for persons with disabilities. We look for meaningful activity as a venue so that the person with the disability can become a productive member of society, live independently, and experience a good quality of life. And so that generally, again, is through employment, right? When you meet someone, what's one of the first things that you ask? And you can speak because I can't see the chat.
What do you do?
Right. So recognizing how significant what you do is on your identity as a person, on how you feel about yourself, on how others view you, right? How society in general views you. So that is why it is key, the work that we do as rehabilitation counselors, to allow persons with disabilities those opportunities for employment or independent living success. And so I think it's important to share a little bit of history about rehabilitation counseling. Note, because what you might not know is that rehab counseling is the only field that was legislated into existence. And this is just a brief timeline of the history of rehabilitation counseling legislation, but it started with the Smith-Fess Act in 1920, which was the Civilian Vocational Rehabilitation Act, and it's established the first VR program for Americans with disabilities. And then we have the Randolph-Shepard Act, and that was for people who have visual disabilities to allow them the opportunity to enhance their employment possibilities and authorize them to be able to operate vending facilities on federal property and research other types of work they could be capable of. The Barton-La Follette Act expanded vocational rehabilitation services to people with not just physical disabilities, but also mental and visual disabilities as well. And then we have the Rehab Act amendments of 1954, which authorized research and demonstration grants, extension and improvement grants, and funds for facility development. Grants were provided to colleges and universities to train rehab counselors to work with individuals with disabilities. And that's a big one. That's how a lot of the programs in rehab counseling got started, with those federal funds. As you can see, there are several other acts, including the American with Disabilities Act that's also included. But in 1973, I want to mention that the Rehab Act was the first act to address the notion of equal access of people with disabilities through the removal of architectural, employment, and transportation barriers. So again, it modeled those actions after the affirmative action policies that were already in place. And so we expanded that to people with disabilities. And then, the ADA of 1990 is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based on disability. So again, rehab counseling has the distinction of being the only counseling specialty that has been legislated into existence. That's pretty dope, right? All right. And so some of you might be wondering, like, how is rehab the same as mental health counseling professions, right? They're different. They can't be the same. Our scope is different. And the answer is yes and no, right? So the first thing is that rehab counseling and mental health counseling both attend to cognitive, behavioral, and emotional aspects of mental health and substance use conditions. We work with individuals, families, couples, and groups in a variety of settings. And just like mental health counseling, we are looking to understand behaviors, emotions, thoughts. We help to identify stressors, and then we teach healthy coping and problem-solving skills. All counselors in general emphasize a wellness model of mental health, which is holistic and strengths-based. So we're looking at what people can do versus what limitations that they have. Okay. And so how is rehabilitation different than other counseling professions? Well, this is where I brag a little bit, right? So I tell folks all the time, like, we know everything that you know as a clinical mental health counselor with additional knowledge in specific psychosocial aspects of disability, medical aspects of disability, looking at a more intense vocational and career counseling and placement, vocational assessments and appraisals, and vocational consultation for services for employers. And so our techniques that we use are similar to what clinical mental health does, but again, with these additional knowledge and skill sets. And so assessment is key in that, diagnosis and treatment planning, case management, and advocacy. Advocacy is another big piece of what rehab counselors do, because we work to modify the environment and attitudinal barriers for placement related services and and we also use rehabilitation technology. So we have a whole assistive technology piece that we learn about so that we can help individuals with disabilities get everything that they need, again, to live more independently, to perform on, to find competitive employment, to have an improved quality of life. Are there any questions or comments at this point? Okay, all right, we'll keep it moving. So when we look at the essential job functions of rehabilitation counselor, advocacy is key. That is the first thing. That's something that we learn in our master's program. That is also something that we learn in our work with clients, helping them learn how to advocate for themselves. So for example, advocacy may look like an employer or a teacher that may need to be educated about the needs of someone who's recovering from a brain injury or someone with a behavioral condition. So job modifications may be necessary. There may be necessary modifications needed in the learning environment. There may be necessary additional supports that are needed in those settings. And so as rehab counselors, we educate these individuals about what that looks like for the person and how these things can be achieved. We also look to helping the person collaborate with key institutions or organizations that provide services for the consumer. So like governmental agencies, nonprofit agencies, social service agencies. We definitely also assist in those areas as well. Case management is also big key of vocational rehabilitation services. And so you'll see that the vocational rehabilitation counselor spends a great amount of time in coordinating services for the clients, linking them to the necessary services that they need, following up, making sure that the clients got there, even in terms of arranging transportation for clients at times. So there is a huge piece of case management there as well. We also help clients complete paperwork to receive any social services or financial assistance. That is a big piece of what we do. And if you ever talk to a rehabilitation counselor who works at VR services, you'll see that they have very large caseloads. And this is a part of that process, a part of their job duties. We also do job placement. So using vocational assessment and other kinds of testing information to determine like a person's aptitudes, their interest and ability, and placing them in jobs that fit what they want. So it's very person-centered, like you would see in any other counseling setting. We want them to decide what they want to do and help them get there, Rehab counseling also encompasses career counseling, supportive counseling. So we don't do like Freudian psychoanalytic counseling services, but we absolutely provide supportive counseling to individuals who may be dealing with emotional stressors as well as physical disability, and all of the life things, right? All of the things. When we recognize that clients need further assistance beyond what we can provide in terms of counseling, then of course we refer them out for those services. We also provide psychosocial rehabilitation services, demand side employment. So again, talking to employers. We have what are called BRRs, they're business relation representatives, and they actually go out into the field and go to businesses and basically educate them, advocate for them to hire a person with a disability by informing them of, there are certain financial incentives if they hire a person with a disability, teaching them about accommodations, because I think when we think about job accommodations, it's always this big thing, right? This huge thing that is, could be overwhelming for the employer. But what we find, and the research tells us, is that accommodations are very small things. And so the BRRs actually go out into the field and do that on behalf of persons with disabilities. And we also have work in workers' compensation and forensic services. And so when we think about rehab counselors, again, with advocacy and education, so we educate the community. We start with the family. So we also work with families, helping them adjust if a person has an acquired disability, helping them learn how to adjust to that acquired disability, how they can support the person with the disability who is our client. And so there's, a lot of responsibilities in the role of a rehab counselor. All right, and so the VR process on the surface looks pretty simple, right? You have an application for services where the person will request services, they'll complete an assessment, and then you have eligibility determination. So looking at the documentation of the disability, service provisions, which includes an IPE, so that's the individual plan of employment, and that is the specific services to be provided to assist the individual to reach that employment goal. And then we have, and it also includes post-employment services. So that's used to help a person maintain or advance in employment or even regain employment, right? And so then you get the closure, which is the 26, that elusive 26 that rehab counselors look for, which is a successful closure. So that means their job situation is stable. They've maintained employment for at least 90 days. And so what does this have to do with social justice? What does this have to do with racial disparity and equity? Well, one of the things is that we recognize that that our cultural beliefs, our biases, permeate every part of who we are as a person and the people that we work with, right? So you can't separate your cultural views or biases from the job that you do. That is evident. And in rehab counseling, we actually have, again, legislation that speaks to the profession's commitment to providing culturally competent services to people of color with disabilities. That's in Section 21 of our U.S. Rehab Amendment Act. And also it's in our programs, right? So our education programs, our accreditation standards, that's infused in there, or that's explicitly stated in there about cultural competence. And I think somewhere in like the late 90s, you started to see that multicultural class being required as part of the curriculum and graduate programs. So despite those efforts, research shows us that racial disparity exists in VR services. Dr. Bobby Atkins, the Dr. Bobby Atkins, a really good mentor of mine, and a phenomenal lady, did the first ever study looking at racial disparities within the VR system in 1980. And in my conversations with Dr. Atkins, she talked about how excited she was to present her findings, that she, really wanted to, push the needle to change things. And she was met with criticism and skepticism and outright denial. So she definitely got into some good trouble when she produced this research article. And what she found in this landmark national study is that African-American clients in VR received unequal treatment throughout the entire rehabilitation process. And they were less likely to be accepted for VR services compared to white clients. And that is that status 08, this failure to cooperate. So before they could even be brought in for services, they were already determined ineligible. And so the work that Dr. Bobby Atkins did was followed by several other rehab scholars. In the 90s, there were several studies, the early 2000s, and then surprisingly, not again until 2022. So like the last study that looked at this nationally was about 2011. So I don't know if that meant that everything was resolved, we knew all that we needed to do, that we have achieved, equitable, fair services in VR based on clients' race, because the research stopped. The research stopped. And so the newest study was done in 2022. And in general, what all the studies found was that African-American clients were least likely to be closed as rehabilitated, so having that successful job placement. They were least likely to receive competitive employment, so instead they would be in like sheltered workshops, for example, other kinds of work. And then other racial ethnic groups received more services than African-American clients. And in general, white clients were approximately 1.5 times more likely to be accepted for VR services than African-American VR clients. And when we look at the services received based on race, this is what we find, right? We find that the amount and the type of services varies greatly. More money is spent on white Americans, and this is, again, all of the studies, including the newest study that was conducted in 2022, that was published in 2022. So African Americans may get on-the-job training, and white Americans would be provided funding to go to school for 4 years and earn their degrees. And that's for African Americans and Hispanics, those less costly services. And they were also in VR services for a lesser period of time than white clients as well. They had access to higher end services and trainings, and they received more education and training opportunities. And again, this is consistent across the research that was found in 1980 up until 2022, when this recent study was published. And so we know that in general, African Americans are the minority in terms of numbers in the US population, but they are disproportionately have higher rates of disability. And so they've applied for VR services at higher rates than any other group and have been denied at higher rates than any other group. And only 30% of African Americans achieve employment outcomes through VR services as compared to 40% of white Americans. And again, I referenced that study in 2022 by Yin, and what they found is that even over time, the results haven't changed much, and we have disability rights legislation and continuous investment in VR services, but nothing is really changing. So I'd like to hear from you about your thoughts about what I've shared. Does anybody have any specific thoughts, anything that's kind of like they really want to share?
I'm Ingrid, and I wanted
Hey,
to share.
Ingrid.
I was having some thoughts when you were talking, and as a certified rehabilitation counselor, and I had worked for like 10 years, and so I worked in Clayton County in a part of Atlanta.
I know
Um,
where that is.
yes, and then but like when you think about the population of Clayton County, um, and then you go up further north, like into Marietta area and stuff like that. How you were talking about the post-secondary, they pushed for it a lot up in the Marietta area. But people in Clayton, they did, but I just don't think that they were thought of as more of post-secondary, even though they came in requesting it. I just think that, and it's just somewhere like Marietta, I know that, and that's more of a white European area, I think. And they pushed, and they would push to the top about about their whether it be the client or someone connected to that person, that they wanted that particular post-secondary services. They wanted that for their person. So
So
I
you're saying
kind
that
of,
the parents or the
yeah,
person,
the parent,
somebody advocated for them?
yes, and they would really, because some clients will back off, like if they come. But Clayton, it was more like they came and they had to really push and push for that consideration. And even I would try to tell people the truth in Clayton. I would say, well, because they would come and say, well, I want the VR scholarship. It's not anything such as a VR scholarship. And I would say, you have to go through testing, and you have to do the comprehensive vocational evaluation. It has to show that you're going to be successful. And they would say, well, you're discouraging me. I'm like, I'm not discouraging you. I'm just trying to tell you the truth. But it's just, I never worked in Marietta, but that's the difference. Like, I could see the difference between Clayton and another part of Georgia. And I could see what you're saying, basically. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Ashley has said that she would like to see how it impacts a rural community and if funding has an impact on what areas get better service. Well, I think, Ashley, to answer your question, Rehab is a federally funded program, right? So we have funds to provide services for individuals with disabilities. Some communities have less resources, so that definitely does impact in terms of the kinds of services that are available to individuals, for sure. And we recognize that there are a variety of factors that could exist as it relates to the people being admitted to services or not being accepted for services. But the research shows us that there is something there as it relates to racial disparity.
Hi, my name is Karen Dean. I'm a VR counselor out of the Kansas City area, Kansas City, Missouri.
Missouri.
Hi. Hi, and I was recently assigned to a majority Black school district. And what I find is that those kids don't have that motivation or even that drive to go to secondary education. I mean, I'm sorry, a higher education. And their background, they're not taught to value that. And I see a lot of the kids don't have that desire to go to school, or, they hate school, or, the ones that are smart and want to go to school. Yeah, we get them involved, but I'm just saying that a lot of my African-American students don't follow through.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's fear of the government, another system involved, but that's what I find. That's what I see. And
Okay.
I do see racial disparity in some VR offices around the state of Missouri.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Grace, and then I think we have Kaylee.
Yes. Hi, I'm Grace. I actually a colleague of Karen's. We work in the same office in Missouri. And I was just gonna pretty much say what she said, because I have the other half of the Kansas City School District. I used to have another one. But like she was saying, a lot of the students, they're not motivated. But I think too, a lot of them, they have a trust issue. There's a trust factor going on there. But in our case, like even when we sign a student up and they want us to help them with college or a training program, then we've got to get like a family income information. And a lot of times the Black community, they don't want to give that information. They feel like we're asking too many questions. So, I mean, there's a lot of barriers with that, is because if the student is living with the parent, we can't go in and say, okay, they're homeless. And if the parent hasn't, it has to be at least 2 years that they haven't claimed them on their taxes before we can just go ahead and advocate and say, we need to go ahead and pay for this because they don't have it. I mean, and a lot of them don't, but I'm kind of like what Karen was saying, they're just not motivated. And I think a lot of it has to do with trust. They don't have anyone that's actually saying, okay, this is what you need to do, or maybe you should think about, going this path. Because a lot of them just say, oh, I'm just going to work, and so then they feel like going out, if they get a job at Burger King, then they're just going to work and save their money. I mean, how do you work with them on that? It's like,
Right, getting that
you think you're going
family
to be able to
support.
save that much money working at Burger King? Because I've even had something to say, I'm going to take a gap year. Do you even know what that is? What are you going to do? So,
And so I think that's a separate issue from what we're talking about tonight, but I do think that it could be impact on like the number or the kinds of services that
Right.
are provided, for sure. We have quite a few comments in the chat, but I think Kaylee, am I saying your name correctly? You had your hand up next.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kaylee. I'm a first year grad student in North Carolina. So I'm just taking foundational courses, and I'm taking the diverse population course. And in that course, I've been learning that like a lot of like systemic discrimination happens, and it's really, I've been learning that the pain and like suffering is like really like it's real and it's really bad. And a lot of people have like no time to recover from it, and it gets exhausting, and it's almost really hard to like, kind of similar to PTSD, really hard to recover. So like seeing that, like, you know, this is like a legislated area of counseling, and that the rate is so high, I feel like it just, you know, it's like sad. And I feel like it means something. And like even with the, you know, like not as motivated kids, like I feel like that could be a factor as well, because like maybe their whole life, you know, they're really tired, or like, you know, something has impacted them.
Yeah. And I think there was some comments about trust, and then we talk about cultural mistrust, which is not, you know, someone's imagination. It's the lived experience of people of color who recognize that when they interface with certain systems, that these folks might not necessarily have their best interests. And so the idea of not sharing information, not necessarily being super cooperative, definitely plays a factor. Go ahead, Jorge. Thank you.
Oh, one thing I will say is that too is that one thing that we also need to recognize is that the lack of motivation, that can also be a trauma response. You have to recognize that when you are a CRC, you represent a government entity, and we can't be naive to the fact of what is occurring to marginalized groups in the US. So that's just something that I'm just saying in terms of that, because they come into a government agency for services. But what about the fear? What about the trauma response to everything that they're seeing on social media and stuff like that?
That's absolutely a great point. And this is why we have these initiatives and these pushes for that, so that counselors can have the adequate knowledge, skills, and ability to work effectively with people from diverse cultural backgrounds. And you know, that's the basis of the, you know, multicultural competencies. That's the basis of that part of our education and training. Does someone else want to share? And can you mute yourself, please? Okay. All right. So when we talk about what can rehab counselors do, that leads us to that, right? So when we think about all the myriad of factors that might relate to why things are the way they are, why certain clients may not be getting equitable services, one thing that we can do, and that has been done, is to talk about multicultural and social justice counseling competencies. Have you guys heard of this? The new multicultural and social justice counseling competencies? Okay. All right, good. So then you know that it encompasses self-awareness, which is, you know, taking an inventory of one's own assumptions about human behavior, values, preconceived notions, limitations, and biases, biases related to race, to ethnicity, culture, and even looking at the socio-political impact of one's cultural group membership to power, to privilege, discrimination, and oppression. So really thinking about where you are and what your belief system is like. Knowledge, when you are looking at understanding your own understanding of the worldviews of clients who are culturally different without imposing negative judgments or blaming or invalidating the other person's experience. When you have people tell you, you know, I can't do this because of that, you know, it's like, oh, is that an excuse or whatever? And it's not, right? So we have to be very much aware of how we perceive other people and recognize that our ability may not be theirs. And our goal is to get them to a place where they recognize that they can do the things that they set out to do, that it is our job, you know, as rehab counselors and in any counseling arena or specialty area to help individuals achieve the goals that they set for themselves. All right, when we talk about skills, we're looking at the ability to develop and practice appropriate, culturally relevant, sensitive interventions. And interventions that are tailored to working with clients from historically marginalized groups and backgrounds. So we recognize, again, that a lot of what we learn is coming from, it's not culturally normed, right? So we recognize the assessments that we use may not be, normed for the population that we're going to use them with. So really making sure we tailor those things and those tools out there so that they are appropriate for the culturally diverse client that we're serving. And I talk fast, y'all, so if I'm going too fast, let me know. Action is the fourth dimension for the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies. And so we're moving beyond talking, but actually doing, right? Actually getting out of our office and working in the community, partnering with community agencies and other allies, using our advocacy interventions and really going about the business of remedying social injustice. Like, it's our job to address these things and to reduce the amount of barriers that are out there for the clients that we serve. And I always tell my students, especially, like, you're only as good as your community resources. So being able to link your clients to the specific things that they need in order to be successful is going to be key. And that those things happen with partnerships. So you actually getting out and talking to people, talking to the business owners, talking to the various nonprofit organizations, really doing your job and building up your own resources for community resources, building up your own, network, that's the word, of community resources that are available. And then as we talk about, racism and oppression, really understanding that the negative influence that oppression and racism has on mental health and well-being. We talk about racial trauma, we talk about trauma, but do we understand what that really looks like for a person who not only has a disability, but also a person of color, right? Looking at the intersectionality of identities and how all of those things together create an even greater barrier to independence, to employment, to a quality of life. All right, and so I ask you, are you aware of your own biases? And that's bias towards any race, religion, gender, socioeconomic status, culture, sexual preference. Take a few minutes and think about it. When you see someone who looks different than you, what are your first immediate responses when they walk through the door or when you see their face, even virtually? Are they positive, mostly positive? Are they mostly negative? Are they stereotypical? And then, are you aware of acts of racial microaggression? Do you yourself commit acts of racial microaggression? And at this point, anyone can share. Like, if you want to share experiences or talk about, your thoughts about these things and how it affects your ability to perform your job, please feel free to speak up.
I find that
I'm sorry, I can't see who's speaking, so whomever can.
okay. I find that trying to see people as a person and And I mean, it might be wrong or maybe naive because I've kind of been in the situation. I'm multiracial. And so people automatically assume one thing or whatever. So when I see a person, I see that I automatically try to find like a good character trait or something. So then I can approach and talk, because I think there's only one person in here that actually kind of knows me. I'll address you, hey, hun, or hi, sir, hi, ma'am, how are you doing? You know, and then I ask them, you know, how are they doing? You know, kind of be relatable to people instead of just always this kind of looking for a reason, I guess you could say, to kind of have that bias. Now, it's taken me years of, you know, growing up and developing as a person to do that, but I try to be more relatable than anything because they are a human just like I am. And that, yes, they do come from a different cultural background or, you know, diversity than I do. But at the end of the day, they are a human. They want to be treated with respect and dignity, just like anybody else.
Right.
So,
and to your point, having that therapeutic alliance, that working alliance, that client counselor rapport, that's the foundation of any good counseling relationship to have any successful outcomes. So having respect is definitely a key component of that. And so some of the other things that you can do, and again, rehab counselors or any counselor, is not be afraid to broach the discussion about race, right? It's not something that has to be avoided. In fact, research tells us that white counselors who actually talk about race to clients who are ethnically diverse tend to be seen as more reliable or more credible, and having stronger working alliance than those who did not discuss such differences. So it may be beneficial to bring up the reaction of the client in talking about bring up the reaction of the client to a counselor of a different ethnic background. You can always talk to clients about what they feel about counseling, rehab counseling, or mental health counseling, and how is that going to be useful for them. Identifying the expectations and worldviews of culturally diverse clients, you know, find out what they believe, right? Asking them what they think and then what their feelings are. Part of it also too is you doing a little work on your own and at least having some foundational knowledge of what certain racial ethnic groups, mannerisms, behaviors, beliefs might be. Recognizing that there are going to be individual differences, but having some foundational knowledge is important. In my class that I teach at Winston-Salem State University, the students always talk about how like not having eye contact is seen as like a negative thing. It could be seen as a lack of respect, that the person's not interested, that they're not paying attention, all these things. But we recognize that in some cultures, it's a point of deference. So you don't have eye contact because you do respect the person. So just having that one little nugget might make the difference when you encounter a client from that cultural background. One of the other things that I think is important to do, and I don't see that's done often in practice, is actually asking the client about their experiences facing discrimination. Like, and how have they responded to that? Right? Having that frank conversation. Also using a strengths-based approach. So not looking at it from a deficit, but from what they bring to the table. What resources do they have? What's their social support system look like? You know, what are their protective factors that could contribute to positive client outcomes? And also practicing fidelity and justice. So doing what's right, keeping your word, providing equitable resources, giving people what they need and how much of it that they need, right? That's important, especially as rehab counselors where there's such a power difference. And then the other thing, as always, really is to examine your own biases. Like engage in self-reflection, check yourself. If you find yourself reacting to something that you may not have, it may not have occurred to you before. Like, what is that initial gut reaction? What is your, first impressions of people? And how does that play into how you interact with them, the kind of services that you provide, especially, again, from the rehab counseling perspective? And then the question I have for you guys is, what actions can you take as a counselor when you become aware of the need to further engage in the process of developing cultural competence? What can you do?
Get outside your comfort zone, start asking the questions, that make people uncomfortable, and learn.
Okay. Do you have a specific example of what that might look like?
Sign up for some seminars concerning some areas that you're not very familiar with.
Okay.
I think advocating and speaking up, because I think just our voice matters, just both as professionals. We're also the voice of those marginalized groups that have been often underheard and underserved. I think also calling out, other professionals, because me too, I would love to be called out if I know that I could be doing something better, receiving that feedback. I think we have to be able to take that constructive growth, because our profession is ever changing, that we also have to recognize that we're lifelong learners too.
Absolutely. And we talk about having like in-service training as well, right? Like having these kinds of conversations in the workplace so that supervisors and, staff alike, rehab counselors alike, are getting the same information, talking about it. Like, how does this apply in our workplace? What can we do specifically? I think is very much key. And always speaking up when you see injustice, right? Some people are like, well, I'm gonna stay in my lane. No, don't stay in your lane. Like, when you see something that is wrong, when it doesn't feel right, when you know that it's not right, absolutely speak up. Absolutely speak up. Because again, this is a systemic problem. So it's not just your office, your agency, it is the entire system. So something has to be done, locally, so that we can from there, move up the ladder and affect the entire system.
I think the unconscious bias is the tricky stuff to get through. I mean, there's obvious conscious. I work in a very, very, very small town. So the obvious conscious bias isn't necessarily a racial bias. It's like, oh no, someone with that last name, so that's one thing to get past. And a lot of times it's important to have colleagues to speak to, like, and say, where you just can ask, am I doing this? Am I looking at this right? Or am I being biased here? What does it look like from your end when you see me speaking with someone?
Yeah. And I'm a big advocate for clinical supervision, which I recognize doesn't necessarily happen as much as it should, but having that safe space to talk about, hey, I had difficulty in working with this client. I need to process this, and there's no penalty for that, right? So providing more opportunities for those kinds of frank conversations about, your work as a counselor without the fear of being penalized for that.
I think it's important too to build relationships where you can not only call each other out, but you can explain what was wrong about it without, hopefully without offense, because the spirit of offense just gets in the way with everything. But be open enough to understand, because ignorance is not always bliss. Ignorance a lot of times hurts others. And be open to understanding. And when you feel the atmosphere shift, just ask, what happened? What did I say wrong? How did that make you feel? And just kind of dig into it rather than shy away from it.
Absolutely. And so these are my selected references. And I guess if we have a minute or two for questions or comments, moderator, doctor. Marlon.
Absolutely. We can field a question too.
Sorry, I know I'm here a lot. I was wondering, is there any kind of statistical research or evidence for how maybe Black American veterans have been impacted, how this impacts them as well? Because I mean, it kind of has like a double whammy, I would think, in some aspects.
I actually haven't looked specifically at that population, but as we know, there is, you know, the intersectionality of identity, right? So we know that being Black, having a disability, and we already know that there is a lots of emotional, mental health trauma that comes from being an active service person. So I would imagine that, you know, the results will probably be the same in terms of, you know, difficulty being accepted for services, probably less successful outcomes.
Because I do know the impact of homelessness for American veterans within the Black community is at, I think, a 38th percentile. And that's actually one of the higher out of like the racial demographics and backgrounds of ethnicity is the Black American. Sorry, I'm outside. That would be one of the studies that I would like to see maybe more on.
Well, if that is your area of interest, I encourage you to pursue it. Find you a good mentor, someone who likes to do research, and get it done. I mean, we need more people who are really interested in doing the research, and then, you know, being action oriented in terms of providing some kind of agenda to help make the change. Advocacy, again, is key, and advocacy without action is just, you know, rhetoric. We have enough of that. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I hope that you were able to get some good takeaways, and my contact information, I think, is on the flyer maybe. If you would like, or I can put it in the chat if you would like to reach me.
Absolutely.
There you go.
Can we all just put some love in the chat for the work and the love that Dr. Rogers has put into today's presentation? I am deeply, deeply encouraged by this question and by thinking through how might we engage more deeply, not only in the field of rehab counseling, but as more culturally inclusive and culturally aware professionals inside of mental wellness and vocational rehab. So thank you for your truth telling tonight. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
For those of you who are here and are excited to give us some feedback about tonight's presentation and are also here for continuing education credit, I'll put the link one more time inside of our chat for our survey. In order for you to receive credit, you have to fill out this survey so that we have your information. That's the only way we can give y'all your CE certificates, okay? So give us some feedback, give us some support, help make these webinars that much better in the future. So while I say that, be on the lookout, whether you are part of Counselors for Social Justice or for NAMRIC. We would love to have you all be a part of our ongoing events. So look up counseling-csj.org. Dr. Rogers, would you, do you have on hand the NAMRIC website?
NAMRIC.org.
There it is, plain and simple, NAMRC.org. Okay. If you are enjoying events like this and webinars and want to be a part of putting things on for us with CSJ, reach out to me. The email for us is professionaldevelopment@counseling-csj.org, or go to our website that our president, Dr. Ebony White, has put in the chat, counseling-csj.org. thank you all for your time and for your energy. And again, much love to you, Dr. Rogers, for the wonderful presentation tonight.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
With that.